Hi everyone. What follows is a long discussion I had with Patrick Watson. Patrick is an experienced and very knowledgeable astrologer who has carried out excellent and very revealing research on the correlations between planetary cycles and periods in history when important events were taking place, such as the birth of the USA, the period of the Civil War in the 1860s, the Second World War, and the 9/11 period. We also discussed Trump's chart at length, what his future looks like in the near and longer term, as well as the difficult period the US is traversing as we find ourselves deeply divided and unable to find common ground. To connect with Patrick and his work, please see the links to his website and Twitter account, which I've listed in the description of this video. Enjoy. The politics it's just a constant thing. It's just a stream of insanity. As soon as you think you've seen the craziest thing, then another crazy thing follows. And so in the last, even today, yesterday, we're seeing Trump doing his word salad.
Oh gosh. Yeah, no, I'd have plenty to say about that and his astrology and his role seemingly in this whole American drama.
Well, what do you see? I know that at one point I saw something you posted somewhere where you had seen this chart. Jupiter is in a really elevated position, and that was a bit of a downer. In that, I think it was one of the indictments or something. And in other words, that was a chart that possibly looked good for him, in contrast to many others that don't look so good.
Right. Yeah. So Trump has Leo rising, very late Leo rising, and there's could be some question over whether or not, if you think the time on his birth certificate is slightly rounded or slightly earlier. I mean, it's plausible that he could potentially be a Virgo rising, but I think he certainly matches some of the more negative characteristics of Leo rising chart in terms of representing someone who is maybe a very proud and boastful individual. Right. And depending on the house system you use, you may see Jupiter right now as being in his ninth house. According to the house system that I use, which is the whole sign house system, if Trump is a Leo rising, then automatically Taurus, being the 10th sign from the ascendant, becomes the 10th house of career and reputation and authorities. And so now that Jupiter has moved into his 10th house, in the midst of all of these indictments, this makes me think that he would probably end up being able to find favor with a higher authority, say judges he's appointed, or perhaps in the worst case scenario, if Biden lost the 2024 election and say a Republican president pardons him, whether that's himself or someone else. And one other thing that kind of sticks out about that Jupiter transit in his 10th house is that in the spring of 2024, Jupiter will be conjunct Uranus. And that's going to be happening really closely to the degree of his midheaven. And Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions take place about 13 to 14 years apart. And they only happen in one area of the zodiac every 83 years. So it's a pretty rare phenomenon, depending on where it's happening in your natal chart. So for him, this is the first time in his life that Jupiter will be conjunct Uranus in his 10th house. And the archetypal combination of Jupiter and Uranus is evocative of sort of grand breakthroughs, or Jupiter is sort of expanding and confirming or validating the kind of revolutionary and norm-defying impulses of Uranus. So it seems like the stage would be set for a kind of Hail Mary pass, where he's able to just kind of get out of the whole situation. And believe me, and just for complete disclosure, I am not a Trump fan. I am extremely anti-Trump. So, I don't take a lot of joy in saying that. As a human being, as an American, I know I don't sound American, but I am an American citizen and I have lived here since 2000. And it's very distressing that this situation is even happening at all. It's insane, that he's acted in this way, and that he continues to evade being properly accounted for, or rather having to face accountability for his actions. And so, I think, if we are supposed to be a nation of laws, right, then those laws should apply. But I just think that this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in his 10th house is more suggestive of someone who kind of is able to gain favor in an especially unanticipated or remarkable way from or with authorities. So I'd say some sort of presidential pardon, or otherwise an extremely lenient and likely Trump-appointed judge who hears his case.
And this would be, and you're pointing to that late May conjunction.
Yeah. So would you like me to bring up the chart so we can take a look?
Yeah, well, you can do that. I have it as well, but yeah.
Okay,
sure.
yeah. If you'd like to bring it up, we can look at it.
Actually, let's see.
I don't have it up. I don't have his data up right now. I'd have to put it in.
I use the same, by the way, the same system as you. I use the whole sign. The only thing is I always draw my charts in equal house and read it as whole sign, because
Gotcha.
I use the ascendant as the the strongest anchor.
Makes sense.
Okay, so because what I was thinking is there are two passes of that conjunction, I think, or not? Is it just once? Let's see. So in May of 24,
it's like in April or May of 2024.
22 degrees. Yeah, it's in April. Yeah, in April 21, a little before his midheaven. Then Jupiter, no, so it's just once. Okay, so let me get his chart, if I can find it somewhere.
I think I actually remember the data, unfortunately. He recently had his birthday.
He did.
Happy birthday. That face.
Right. So the conjunction is up here.
Right.
Uranus and Jupiter, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where that conjunction is happening. And that, like I said, a Jupiter-Uranus, the last time a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction happened in the sign of Taurus was 1941. So this is the first time that this has happened in his natal chart. And this particular one is happening in the 10th house of career and reputation and authorities. Any house that Jupiter is transiting through in your natal chart is going to be suggestive of an area where you are maybe the recipient of a certain degree of forgiveness or abundance or bounty. It expands and ennobles, that part of your life. And so this is someone who, finds himself in terrible trouble. And so that's the only reason why, I go like, oh no, well, this has this really good looking aspect. What on earth could that be? It seems like things will go a lot better for him than would otherwise be anticipated. And again, I say that with, with no joy.
So I guess I need to cheer you up here, right?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm probably a bit pessimistic in general about the overall trajectory of the United States. So.
Trump to me is I mean, the way I understand astrology is that yes, you can get reversals, and certainly if you bring Uranus into the mix, that's for sure the sudden unexpected thing that can happen. That's true. But at the same time, you also have to look at all the transits that are taking place.
That's right.
And it's pretty clear with this guy that once Saturn entered Pisces, which I had said repeatedly in 2022, as soon as this planet enters Pisces, things are going to get rough. And they did immediately. In March, you saw Alvin Bragg. Soon after that, Jack Smith. Now there's more coming. And so the way I see a chart, any chart really, is there's a momentum that gets built. And a really great example of this is Bernie Madoff. If you look at his chart, when he totally crashed and burned and was put in prison for life, there was a Jupiter trine right in the midst of that. The problem is that its Jupiter at birth makes a pretty big square, so it took that energy and basically added to the other transits that were happening, and in no way saved him. He went straight to the slammer and never got out. And to me, Trump, the only aspect that works for his Jupiter happened in 2016. If you put Jupiter in Libra, you create trines, it got him in, which actually was a big mistake in my opinion, because getting in there immediately made him vulnerable to all kinds of problems, which he's experiencing now. But that's a separate topic. The point being that Jupiter, for example, when Jupiter is in his on his moon, that's when he you remember it, when Jupiter went through his moon, he engaged with Bill Barr, and he went through that whole thing, and he tried to extort Ukraine, and the whole thing blew up in his face.
That's
so
right.
he doesn't get any decent results with Jupiter cycles, the kind you would expect, including, by the way, that you mentioned, Jupiter went through the ninth, and if you're looking for benefic results, that wasn't exactly the case. When Jupiter was in the early degrees last year, triggering his the T-square, I use Eris a whole lot, Eris opposite Neptune square Mercury. That was when the January committee, the committee that was formed with Liz Cheney, etc., was just pounding on the guy. And very soon after that, in August, was when the FBI raid happened, which is what he's now living with. So you'd hardly say that Jupiter in Aries blessed his legal situation.
Maybe
so
kept him out of jail, perhaps.
Well, of course, but jail is very difficult. Any person in the American and the British system, I don't know about the British system as much, but in North America,
neither do I.
Yeah, I know.
I
mean, and this I'm just saying from observing. What I notice is that people that get ensnared in legal troubles, like a great example is that woman who was doing the blood scandal, Elizabeth Holmes.
Yes.
She gets nabbed in 2015. I mean, the whole thing fell apart. It took 7 years to finally convict her. She's still trying to wiggle out. I think it won't work.
Right.
But the main point is, if you have lawyers, you're looking at a long trajectory before you're actually jailed. But the momentum here to me is really bad. And so you can say, yes, okay, so Jupiter, Uranus up here, this means he'll find favor with a judge, he'll get helped out. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that those are the authorities that are also pursuing you. And the thing about Trump is, one of his secrets, as I see it, is a stationary Jupiter trining his sun, sextiling his moon. That's great, no question. But it squares his 12 sign planets. That's not good, because he commits all his crimes in the 12th. So that planet now is circulating around, and it's not really helping him.
Gotcha.
But, I'm open to, I can see what you're saying. And
well, I mean, it's that is definitely, I didn't want to give anyone the impression that I wasn't taking into account any of the other transits. But I do think that Uranus is a major one to keep track of for Trump, because as you can see, he was born at a lunar eclipse that was configured with Uranus and Gemini. Correct. Now, a lot of people have been talking. A lot of people, a lot of astrologers.
People are saying.
People are saying. So a lot of astrologers have been saying, when you look back at what's happened when Uranus has gone through Gemini, you see these recurring periods of self-renewal and self-reinvention of the United States, especially through violent means. So just as a very brief rundown, in the 1770s, you have the American Revolutionary War. 84 years later, you have the Civil War. 84 years later, you have American involvement in World War II. So we're now coming back to this Uranus and Gemini period. When you look back at the kinds of figures that have emerged during previous Uranus transits through Gemini, where they have the Sun conjunct Uranus and Gemini, there's the there was the president of the Confederacy back in the 1860s, Jefferson Davis. He has a son in Gemini, and Uranus conjoined his son in Gemini as he became the new the president of the Confederacy. You had the first governor in American history. You had Patrick Henry, who became first governor of Virginia with the sun in Gemini, Uranus conjoining his sun in Gemini. You even had King George III with the sun in Gemini, with Uranus coming into a sun in Gemini as the American colonies were establishing independence. So there seems to be this theme in American history during those Uranus and Gemini periods, which just by themselves are a very impressive kind of pattern that is strongly suggestive of great tumult and upheaval in the next several years. But even within those times, that some of the people who end up kind of coming to the front or the forefront of the sort of Uranian movements at those times for freedom in some form, whether it's legitimate or not, are these Gemini suns.
Mm-hmm.
And so in many ways, Trump has the most star-spangled chart there is. Anyone who's born at a Sun-Uranus conjunction in Gemini kind of is tapping into this idea of like the American leader. Another example of that actually is Rudy Giuliani, who was born with the Sun conjunct Uranus in Gemini, and back before he was being caught with his pants down and his fake hair running down his face, and and being Trump's little toad, before all that happened. Remember, he was at one time, very held in high esteem, as the mayor of New York during the 9/11 attacks. And of course, that occurred while Saturn was in Gemini opposite Pluto in Sagittarius. So this Gemini is really the sign that seems to correspond most with these just crucial chapters in American history. And so in many ways, Trump is like very uniquely kind of tied into that system. If Trump lives to be old enough to experience his Uranus return, then I would fully expect him to kind of occupy a Jefferson Davis-like role in the United States at that time, being the new president of the Confederacy or of the separatist faction of the United States that wants to become Trumplandia. Mm-hmm. Because he sort of has this Mad King signature in his chart.
Correct.
With the Sun conjunct Uranus. He's the unbounded, it's the thing that kind of makes him ridiculous and also kind of uncontrollable, and just this sort of force of nature that has to be bitterly opposed, right? Because it's this is caused a lot of big problems. Now, granted, there may be some people listening to this show right now, maybe they have Sun conjunct Uranus and think, well, I'm not leading insurrections against the United States. And I understand that, but it's still interesting that these relatively small sections of time still outline basically the major wars where the country redefined itself, first as an independent country, then as a country where slavery was no longer accepted and where the federal government would be the one in control, and then finally reinventing itself as a superpower in the aftermath of World War II. And so the United States is due for a self-reinvention, and there's going to be two paths before us with Uranus and Gemini, in the same way that the Civil War was divided between the North and the South. There will be a similar kind of division, or twin halves of the United States have to reconcile with each other or separate. If you really want to know what I think, I wonder if there would be some sort of like reverse Civil War type of development where, say, the blue states want to secede, where we have like these secession movements, right. Maybe from both the left and the right, where, say, like the blue states want to form a kind of bi-coastal alliance, of the Northeast and the West Coast, and then Texas wants to be its own thing, and the Heartland breaks off, but wants to join with the Texas contingent, and Florida is its own nation or something like that. I think we'll sort of see this like a balkanization of the United States, which would be a terrible, terrible, terrible development. But I wonder if it might ultimately be what becomes necessary. If anyone wants more information, by the way, about Uranus and Gemini, and the history of the United States and what to sort of expect during those times, I'd highly recommend a podcast that Nick Dagan Best, my mentor, was on. He's done a lot of this research on Uranus and who I'm pulling a lot of this information from. And he talked about this at great length and detail with Chris Brennan on an episode of the Astrology podcast. So if you just type in to Google, say, Uranus and American history, the Astrology podcast with Nick Dagan Best, you'll probably find that episode.
I heard that episode. It's really good, and I'll put I'll make sure that I put all the information in the description so people can go there. It's a really good episode.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the thing is though that you see, like, it depends on how you interpret what happened at each of those points. For example, it's totally true what you're saying, Jefferson Davis, the Civil War period, but what happened? What happened is there was that huge conflict. The great misfortune was that because of that very contested election, they then made compromises that they then created 100 years of setback in terms of actually implementing what Lincoln had passed. The full freedom. It became a kind of partial freedom. But nevertheless, the country continued, even though there was that huge problem. And it's curious that one of the things that I heard from you that was really impressive was when you were looking around at the Saturn cycle and you said, hey, Saturn in Aries has this, strange coincidence with gun legislation.
That's right.
So to me, what's happening here is that, this guy is the president of a confederacy, no doubt. Trump and Trumpism. That's what the Confederacy is in modern day compared to, say, the 1860s. However, if you look at the upcoming years, and they will continue to be turbulent, to me, it seems more likely that the problem that is going to develop is that they're going to lose the next election. And so then that's when you're going to get unrest and violence, because if Democrats lose, they typically don't engage in violence. Democrats walk away with their tail between their legs and they complain that things didn't work. Very seldom will you see the uprising of Democrats. The uprising is on the right. And therefore,
sometimes I wish we would see a little more uprising from the Democrats. I mean, you'd think that would have happened in 2000 at the very least,
exactly,
or in 2016. I mean, oh my gosh. Anyway, sorry, not to interrupt you.
Yeah, no. This was just to say that to my mind, the way to see the Uranus unrest, which is, I agree with you, there's no question that was there in the Second World War, although that was a foreign enemy, and that might develop in this case too, because we're seeing some shifts, between what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and then there's the China thing. Right. It's possible we'll get some problem there as well. But because it mirrors the Uranus-Neptune are very similar to the Civil War. So it's more likely to go that way. But to me, the patterns point to the likelihood of the right wing being really displeased with what is going on, and then the unrest and that comes from that, rather than that Trump gets installed on a second term. And because in a way, that wouldn't be as much unrest, let's just say, from my perspective. Right.
Yeah, no, I and I've gone back and forth on this. Is it worse or better for the country? If or rather, what's is it worse if we have a Republican president, or is it worse if we have, enraged, armed people on the right because of democratic initiatives getting passed? I mean, really, it seems like the one major thing that just pisses off the right more than anything else is guns, and it provokes the most existential anxiety. I mean, that and trans children, they can't handle those things, but especially guns. And so yeah, I have considered that, that the work I did, Andre here is referencing an article that I wrote a while ago about how some of the most notable attempts at gun reform in the United States and in other countries have occurred during Saturn and Aries periods, which actually makes a fair amount of sense, because Mars is the domicile lord of Aries, and Mars is the representative weapons. And aggression in astrology, and so Saturn is a controlling and limiting and regulating force, and so
exactly
Saturn in Aries, the control and limitation of weapons sort of makes astrological sense as well. And
Right.
So yeah, with Saturn going into Aries, say Biden gets reelected, we get some gun control legislation passed finally, and yeah, this is enough to set off the this is the final straw in some people's books, in the January 6th crowd's books. This is it. This means war. And of course, they would also be kind of invalidating the other argument they make, which is that they act responsibly with their guns. But so they have to be careful there. But I think that it could be another scenario. I mean, I know, like, for example, Gavin Newsom very recently has proposed, he's the governor of California.
Mm-hmm.
He proposed a constitutional amendment to enact gun control instead of relying on a sort of federal solution, just kind of going right to the source, going right to the Constitution. And, I would wonder if something like that could still be possible, even if the Democrats lost the White House in 2024.
That's the point. That's exactly the point. That, I mean, when I heard your research, I thought that's a major point toward them losing the White House, because there's no way they'll implement any gun legislation. That's not going to happen.
Right.
Particularly not this crew. Not this.
So then the only other way would be if states did. If you had enough states agree, you need 2/3. If you had
okay. So you're saying,
yeah. So what I'm saying is, or what if a Republican could win the presidency, but then you might still have enough states to actually pass a new amendment. Now, this is very unrealistic. It takes a lot of effort and time,
leap, right?
Yeah, that's a leap of faith. The American system is just designed to grind these things to a halt. Change like that, anything like that doesn't happen very quickly.
Right.
On that level, like a constitutional amendment. So, yeah, I've been going back and forth over what exactly it means. I think, from the perspective of Saturn in Aries, I think it certainly makes more intuitive sense than that the Democrats should be able to prevail in 2024. I still have some thoughts about what that looks like, because, and I haven't published this yet. I might have mentioned it on one of my live streams with Nick, but there seems to be a kind of troubling pattern of transits through Pisces for Joe Biden. If you want to bring up Joe Biden's chart real quick.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have that.
I do. I have them all. Yeah, somewhere. Let's see. It might be here, but here's his chart. Go back in here. Can you see it?
Yes. Yeah. So as you can see, the Pisces is in his 4th house,
Mm-hmm.
which is the part of someone's chart that corresponds to their involvement with their home, their house, their living situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so something kind of interesting about Biden's chart and his experience of transit through Pisces, that they've showed up pretty clearly with his history of residences, going right back to like the mid 1960s when Saturn was in Pisces. He left his family home and he went to live with his then girlfriend in a really cramped, tiny apartment. He bought his first house when Jupiter was going through Pisces. He sold that house when Saturn went through Pisces again in the mid 90s. And in the 2 years that Saturn was going through Pisces, he didn't really have a home. He was kind of, he didn't have a home because his new house was being built on some land that he bought. So, I mean, he wasn't he wasn't homeless, but he was like living in hotels. He didn't have like his house until finally near the end of the transit, he was able to move into his place. When Uranus went through those same degrees in 2008, that was when he moved into the Naval Observatory, where that's where the vice president lives.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Neptune went over those same degrees. He moved in to the White House as president. And Saturn is now in Pisces again. So the last two times that Saturn was in Pisces, the first time, remember, he lost his parent. He moved out of his parents' house and moved into a really tiny place with his girlfriend. In the mid-90s, he sold his house and was without a house for a couple of years while his new house is being built. Mm-hmm. So Saturn's now coming back to Pisces, and it will hit the degree of his IC a couple of times before the
election.
Before the what am I going to say? It'll hit it once before the election and hits it once more in February of 2025. So in other words, a month after the inauguration. And I think the most straightforward way of interpreting that is that in some sense he loses his house, which would be a very bad omen for a sitting president to have. To lose one's house means that, you know, you're not even going to be there. You're not, which makes me wonder if we might see some kind of scenario like, well, hopefully he wins, but if he doesn't, it could either be that he runs and he does not win, and that's the reason why he has that kind of Saturn transit, or for whatever reason he becomes incapacitated, which would have to cause Kamala to be the main candidate, either at some point in the primary or at some point close to the inauguration. Or he simply declines to continue running after some point. So there's a few possibilities there, but based on that sort of repetition of these transits through Pisces and the transit that they make to the degree of his IC, which is 19 degrees of Pisces, that makes me think that he would not be in the White House. He would probably be back at his home.
At his home. Well, that one is interesting because you are matching it to previous patterns.
Right.
I know that one psychic interpretation out there is that he wins, but he's not able to follow through on his term, and it gets turned over to Kamala because he doesn't feel well enough or strong enough, or, you know, it could even be, as you put it.
Do you have Kamala's chart?
I do. I can pull up her chart. Hers is her 10th is Pisces, correct?
Exactly. You're exactly right. In fact, Saturn will hit the degree of her midheaven at the end of this year. And this is interesting because, you know, she's someone who is clearly very, it has to have been, you know, fairly competent, you know, as a former attorney general for the state of California, and to be elected and perform well as a senator for the state of California, and to be vice president, and to be considered good enough to be vice president, to be able to step into the role of president on a moment's notice. So it's interesting that for someone who's achieved so much already, you know, what could it mean that she's now past her second Saturn return and Saturn is now on its way back to the degree of her midheaven? I would think that this could make sense for a time when she maybe would feel the weight of her office.
True.
Which would only make sense if there was some reason why she had to think more seriously and deeply about you know, about the realistic prospects she may have of needing to step in, you know, as the president.
Yeah,
and
that definitely resonates. I mean, this is the thing that you could interpret, but again, if you frame it in the overall idea, do the Democrats win or do the Republicans win? There, you could see you could see the Democrats still winning, and then this is how she then lives out the period, the 4
Exactly.
years with the Saturn. Because this is the thing: Saturn elevated can, in some cases, crush you. It would be like the end of something. It can happen. But look
Hmm.
at Kevin McCarthy. I mean, a man who is, by many accounts, anything from not very bright to a bit of a dimwit, and there he is, in charge of the whole, MAGA thing for now, and he gets there on a Saturn return square the moon, which probably means he might crash and burn before it's over. It's possible, but nevertheless, he did get his position
Yeah,
on the Saturn,
Saturn
right? Yeah.
Saturn isn't always bad when it's going through the 10th. I
No.
mean, it's typically better when you are born during the daytime because then Saturn's at the sect. Now, that's not the case for Kamala. Saturn is contrary to sect, but her natal Saturn is in its own sign of Aquarius, which is
Mhm.
beneficial. And Saturn is also in a square configuration with Jupiter. So Jupiter is able to impart some degree of benefit to its to through its relationship with Saturn. Now, even though it's a square configuration, I still think that I tend to be less skeptical of squares or oppositions from benefics. I think those can still be helpful. Um,
So wait, you said, let me grasp this again. You said
yeah, yeah.
Jupiter to Saturn. Oh, because they're square. They're exact. Okay, so because they're
Right, yeah.
square.
It was just as a way of explaining why maybe her experience with Saturn might not be so bad. Um, so Saturn's already hit her midheaven once, but we know that it will hit it 2 more times due to retrogradation. So we'll hit it in early December, and then I believe it hits it once more when Saturn goes forward in 2024.
Right,
So,
and you probably know this, that her progressed Saturn is now in Pisces. It went direct. That adds to the
oh wow,
strength of
okay,
that sign.
so even more.
Makes it a lot stronger.
Yeah, I
This
didn't know.
was
I haven't looked
something.
at progressions.
Yep, you're not up to what were you saying about progressions, that you're
Oh
not.
no, I hadn't looked at her progressions.
Right. So I remember that back in 2018, what gave me this sense that Biden was going to be elected, he had these really significant planets going direct in his progressions: Mercury, Saturn, Uranus, but especially the Mercury being the ruler of the MC. It just felt like that was really important. And for Kamala, Saturn in Pisces, right at the very beginning, I think it really strengthens the case for her with it already being in Pisces, and then the transiting Saturn, going into Pisces. So yeah, that's how I would see that one.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I can't say that I had my money on Biden in 2020. I mean, to be just perfectly honest, I was pulling for um Elizabeth Warren, or Bernie Sanders. But obviously I got in line and still did my duty and voted for Biden, obviously to stop the orange one from ascending once more. So
Yeah.
I did my part. But yeah, I think it's interesting when you look at these transits to Biden's chart through his career. I think one of the things that is pretty impressive is how eclipses around his midheaven uh, seem to really kind of spell out these significant times in his political career. So, for example, right after he pulled out of his 1988 run, there was a solar eclipse really close to his midheaven, and on the very day that he was um, on the very day that he got the Democratic nomination for president, there was a full moon um, in Pisces. So the sun, I believe, was like on his midheaven opposite the moon in Pisces, which was on his IC. And this is kind of a mirror in some ways of the Saturn Uranus opposition that occurred on November 4th, 2008. when Obama was elected president and Biden was elected vice president. Saturn was approximately at 19 Virgo, and Uranus was around 19 or 18 Pisces. And so that Saturn-Uranus conjunction really aligned up very closely on his chart for election day of 2008. And we can also see that he himself was born at a Saturn-Uranus he was born with Saturn proximally conjunct Uranus and Gemini. And actually, back in 1987, when he first ran for president for 1988, that was during a Saturn-Uranus conjunction in Sagittarius.
Yes.
So he kind of has this Saturn-Uranus theme in his life. And you often see this in many charts. If you're born close to a conjunction of two planets, then in general, you'll tend to respond to that cycle throughout your life, especially if they're angular in your chart. So actually, Biden here has both. He was born not just with those planets proximally conjunct, but also with those two planets conjunct an angle in his natal chart around his descendant. And of course, if we think about the seventh house in terms of partnerships, he has had two marriages. Very sadly, his first marriage ended when she died in a terrible car accident when he was 29 years old, which was his Saturn return in the seventh house. So there's a lot of other things we can glean from that. Obviously, having Saturn in your seventh house isn't the not everyone who has that is necessarily going to have lose their partner in such a terrible way. I think the other reason why we might consider the topic of relationships to work out badly in his chart is because the ruler of the seventh house is Mercury, which is not only combust but in the sign of Mars and close to Mars in the 12th house of suffering and tragedies. And note that Mars also rules his fifth house of children, and his infant daughter also died in that same crash. Right. And even as an adult, he saw his adult son Beau die of cancer. And then even just now, just today, I believe, or yesterday, Hunter Biden, is pleading guilty to these charges being brought against him by the Justice Department. And so, we can see how, the most malefic planet in his natal chart, which is Mars in a day chart, does seem to be, it really has brought, a lot of very terrible types of, or seems to be, coincident with these really sort of tragic developments in his life. And it's also in the 12th house, right, of enemies. And what has Fox News not been able to shut up about, right? It's Hunter Biden this, Hunter Biden that. Why did Trump incite a January 6th riot? Well, Hunter Biden's laptop. There's his children end up becoming the focus of attacks by enemies.
True. That's true.
And there's many other ways we can read those planets in the 12th house as well, but unless you want to go through them.
Yeah, and the children, Pluto square Mars, that alone, you saw what happened.
Pluto, right.
When Saturn triggered that in 2021, Pluto in the ninth, foreign affairs, he does that thing with Afghanistan. That was his worst moment. The Saturn, down here in Aquarius opposing. And, that area is not good for him. The degrees of Pluto Mars.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing up the Pluto connotation to that. That certainly is what probably makes that Mars even more extreme in its manifestation. The Afghanistan withdrawal, I think obviously wasn't maybe executed very well, but it was necessary. The nation can't be at war forever. And really, one could question the wisdom of ever having gone in to Afghanistan in the first place, since the 9/11 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, not from Afghanistan, and certainly not from Iraq, who we invaded shortly thereafter. about a year later or so. The one thing I'll take a little bit of credit for is back in 2019, I published an article about Saturn and Pluto and how people should prepare for Saturn and Pluto. I didn't go too in depth about disease, but did mention it though as one of the possibilities of the Saturn Pluto conjunction of 2020. But one of the things actually I misspoke. It was actually earlier. This is from a video I made back in 2017, I believe, called Sunshine, Daisies, and Rainbows, Saturn and Pluto in 2020. So I was kind of, it's a sort of tongue-in-cheek title, but the one of the predictions I made in that video is that we would see an end to the Afghanistan war in January of 2020 at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, because of the way that the war in Afghanistan had been following this cycle of Saturn and Pluto up to that point.
Right.
And so I said, well, we're coming up to the closing conjunction in January 2020, so that should be the end of the war in Afghanistan. So while the withdrawal happened back in 2021, the actual treaty that signed between the Taliban and the US government was signed in January of 2020. That was negotiated by the Trump administration. So I totally got it.
That's a good call.
Totally called it.
Yeah,
that would be the end of it. And that was about 3 years in advance. So I will take up some credit for that.
Yeah, that's a good call. And this is the thing, that patterns tend to repeat, patterns follow the initial aspects. And so if Saturn and Pluto are involved, it's more likely that they'll show up again.
Right.
This is the thing, though, that you see in this current scenario, the reason I'm optimistic within a very difficult overall situation, there's no question. Even so, the country is formed in 1776 in a battle with Britain. The next, in the 1860s, that was a racial problem, clearly, obviously. Back then, I mean, that was blatantly racial. Now, it's also a racial problem. With Trump is basically a white supremacist. He is, stoking those feelings, and you can see by the demographics who vote for him and so forth that it's pretty clearly that. And the way I look at it is, I say to people, look, we won the last one, we're going to win this one too. It's just that you have to go through the problem. You have to endure the difficulty of it.
I wish you didn't have to. I wish so badly that I could just wake up and it was like
I know,
boring and normal. And
I know.
I feel like Frodo, and when he says to Gandalf, why did it have to happen why did this have to happen in our time? And then Gandalf says something like, we don't get to choose this, and all we can choose is what we do with the time that is given to us. But there you
could turn to the USA chart. It's it's the way it's set up. It's set up for this kind of problem, basically. Every so often, you look back, where was Neptune? Neptune was opposite in the conflict in the Civil War. It had returned to its natal place when we were in the World War in the 1940s.
Right.
And now it's back here again. And Neptune squares Mars. Mars is this whole firearms and so forth. That's part of the reason. One of the ways for me, there's a sense of hope. The Uranus is very strong, and absolutely it's going to correlate with something turbulent. Neptune, though, to me, having Neptune in the 10th in a chart is the clearest signal that this is a democracy. Neptune is the most democratic planet in the idea of inclusive. Everyone counts, rather than Uranus tends to tilt to the I, my, me. So when you get a person with not always, of course, because you get a lot of democratic politicians with Uranus aspects as well. But as a sort of umbrella pattern, I assign Neptune democratic, tilting communist, and then Uranus tilting to the I, my, me energy. Pluto goes fascist.
Anarchist. Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, really, I think the United States is really the Uranus country. It was founded officially not long after Uranus itself was discovered. In fact, the establishment of the first colony at Jamestown, the first town ever established in the United States, rather in the American colonies. Obviously it was owned by Native Americans, but Jamestown was established one day before Uranus entered Gemini, even prior to the 1770s. So this one other thing to keep in mind too is that Uranus crosses its own north node with the sun when it goes through Gemini, and that seems to be why this particular sign seems to be such a big deal for this place that is so distinctly Uranian in some sense. It was the first like modern country. It's really the country of modernity, and there's kind of an insanity here as well.
Well, but to be fair, this democracy has held up for a quarter of a millennium. There's a sense that despite all the complaints, there still appears to be a rule of law, more or less holding up, from what I can see. And so, and again, the elevated Neptune, to me, having Neptune and Virgo, there's a promise there of some eventual, not utopia necessarily, but more inclusiveness around the worker. The Virgo to me signals more the working class than it would, say, the privileged class, from the way Virgo can be, or just having Neptune elevated.
Well, I think Neptune and Virgo has been the romanticization of the agrarian aesthetic and culture. From the early days of the Republic, that you had this very kind of almost glamorized view of the agrarian lifestyle and having your own plot of land and living in the country.
That's true too. Yes,
I think that's a kind of, because Neptune is what is glamorization and idealism. So there's sort of this very agrarian kind of ideal of the United States, grandma's apple pie and rolling cornfields. That's the kind of classic Americana type of view, I think, which is Neptune and in Virgo. I could be wrong about that. There's a lot of things that can mean, but
no, I agree with that. Because you can multiple times I've been in situations where I try to tune into the public mood through the moon, wherever the moon is, and the moon and Virgo, and the tilt toward discussions about sustainable agriculture, growing vegetables in a special way, definitely agrarian concern, gardening, all that stuff. It's definitely true. And see, there you could then say that particular class in this country has actually a lot of power, because it's a bit absurd that the rural counties have so much power in this country.
For sure.
Most of the population you could actually say most of the population is more Uranian, in that the idea of cities and technology and all of that is Uranian. The other thing, by the way, about Uranus is if you look at the chart, it's the planet that previous to the founding of the country, it's in this Gackelin position. It crossed the angle. So that imprints the personality of the country, so that, the U.S. has the most individualistic. I heard a podcast where they were saying that nationality is the best predictor of behavior, and that the U.S. is the most individualistic, most innovative. And this is why vaccines are created here, and then people don't want to take them, type thing. That was the
there you go. You get that. I think of like the Gadsden flag. Don't tread on me. That kind of sort of small c classical liberal / libertarian sort of strain of American political identity of like, don't mess with me, man, like I got my own thing. And while I think that feeling and that sort of approach to life can help propel people maybe to heights that they might not have been able to in other places, I think the country also suffers as a whole when it lionizes people with power. True. Because the other kind of contradiction at the heart of the United States is the fact that we and I say I'm using that more as like the royal we rather than us in particular. But we put these like billionaires on a pedestal, but our system of government though is built to check the power of monarchs, right? I mean, the founding fathers, for example,
Yes.
they in many ways were trying to design this system as a kind of rebuttal or it kind of underlies a fear or betrays a fear of power being concentrated or too concentrated in one person's hands. And so in so many ways they've tried to like check and limit the power of the executive. And but then we also have this culture that you know idolizes the monarchy in the UK and treats them
Right.
like celebrities and pays attention to what Elon Musk has to say. And in some people even sort of like you know glamorize that as well, which is
Hmm.
a little gross.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. It is.
yeah,
It's
you
true.
know we I think the country suffers because community also matters, and I think we lose sight of that when we there's that great quote by the author of The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck. He said that socialism or communism would never succeed in America because Americans tend to perceive themselves as temporarily inconvenienced rich people. Or I guess for the update would be temporarily inconvenienced billionaires. As soon as one day, I could be a billionaire, and that's why I don't want to put any legislation or limitation on
Right.
big business, because that could be me someday, and I would get to be the top dog over the worker.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you end up having workers then voting against their own interests,
Yes.
because they are conflating the needs and desires of the big corporate executive with like a person running a small business.
True.
Um,
Very true.
and
That's
they
very
just
true.
keep hammering Democrats on points like that when Democrats should be able to point out, that Republican, big business policies do not benefit uh, middle America, do not benefit the heartland, do not benefit the poor in the red
Right.
states. And it seems to go in one ear and one ear and out the other. But anyway, sorry for being such a downer.
Well, no, I mean, it's a point of view. Again, we'll see what happens. Like that's what the Orange Menace always says. We'll see what happens. Uh, but yeah, so sure, there's a distinct possibility that this whole thing blows up. I suppose I'm looking at the maybe perhaps a little too much on the positive side. Like give you an example, the U.S. Saturn square Sun country, which pretty much describes the work ethic. I just sort of think around how they're trying to bring in the 4-day work week, but there'll be a lot of resistance to that. The U.S. is one of the most work oriented, driven countries. People don't even get the right to vacation. Really, it's really pretty scandalous. But on the plus side, Saturn is in Libra, exalted, square the Sun. A person or any entity with Saturn square that lives long enough to get wise, and if you've been around the quarter of a millennium, this has been pretty developed. That's going to be a strongly regulated society in some way. Notice the Sun rules the ninth. That's the legal. So, in other words, the rule of law in this country is pretty strong, right?
Well, this
So,
is what I was saying, right? We like to check the executive. We like to check
exactly,
authority figures.
exactly. So
Yeah.
now, and not, moreover, this Saturn is not good for this guy because it's over his Jupiter. And so that's how you check someone's, and it's like, it's sort
Right.
of like a sooner or later, you keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And, Saturn in a way is like the idea that society has rules so we can all survive, and have some order, traffic lights, don't run them because you'll get a ticket. And
Right.
then from there you move up.
But look at where Trump's sun is in the USA chart. What planet is Trump's sun highlighting in the US natal chart?
Well, Mars for sure.
Yeah, there you
Yes.
go.
Yeah, no, Mars.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
no.
he's someone who is absolutely like getting that. Also kind of interesting is he Trump also started the Space Force, right?
Yes.
He kind of expanded the military while he was
Yes.
regretfully in office, and that actually happened. This creation of the Space Force, I believe, was at a Sun Mars conjunction in Virgo. If I'm not mistaken, that might have even been within range of the Neptune placement of the United States. So I would assume that this is this is kind of part of the deal. I honestly am surprised that with the Mars retrograde in Gemini, that the United States didn't somehow ramp up its warlike activities, given that it has Mars in Gemini. I mean, I know that the United States is basically in a covert war, more or less, or maybe overt war with Russia. I know they've been giving a lot of assistance. We've been giving a lot of assistance to the Ukraine effort.
Did you say retrograde? Mars is not retrograde in the U.S. chart, is it?
No. No. Oh, I meant the most recent Mars retrograde that we've
the
had.
most recent. Okay.
Back, yeah, the one from late 2022, early 2023.
Right. Yeah. Right. That makes sense. Yeah. Well, I guess this is one of those things where, in some ways, you track it to see how it develops, and then, for example, there could be momentum in some direction, but the way you brought up Jupiter-Uranus, that would be like the lightning bolt if it happened that way, some kind of thing.
Something that sort of lets him off the hook. I mean, I'm not sure what that could be. It's facing 400 years.
I mean, to me, the thing is, there's something suspiciously aligning with a downtrending in his life. Like, for example, the August period now is looking really dicey because the initial part of the trial is then, plus Fonnie Willis is likely to indict, and there's even a possibility that Jack Smith may jump in there as well. And Trump's ascendant is going from Libra to Scorpio. It's been in Libra since 1985. Those ascendant changes in my life have been really determinative, really noticeable changes.
You mean the progressed ascendant?
Progressed ascendant, yeah.
You gotcha.
Right, and in his case, and because then you get into this pattern where, on one level, you say, okay, it's going to Scorpio now. That affects his fourth sign. Also the ninth, because it's Mars ruled. Mars becomes more of a factor, but also the progressed chart takes on this really interesting look, whereby when he reached the pinnacle of his fame was actually pre-being elected, because he was sort of new on the scene with his insane talk, and the progressed Jupiter was transiting next to the progressed ascendant. Then the progressed ascendant has been separating. Now when the ascendant goes into Scorpio, all those Libra planets go to the 12th house. That is not a good thing. That is not good at all.
No.
I'm sorry, but that is not good. And I don't know how much you've looked at progressed charts on their own, but I've noticed in my life these peculiar patterns that something that is going on, and I can only explain it by the progressed chart.
Yeah. Well, I think Trump is a pretty good example of those progressions. For example, when he won the presidency in 2016, his progressed sun had reached the progressed ascendant, and not only that, but the date of his progression in 2016, his progressed chart had reached a certain number of days past his birth that ends up corresponding pretty closely to Bill Clinton's birthday, like the date that he was born. So his progressed chart when he became president resembles the natal chart of Bill Clinton.
Okay, that's really cool.
President.
That's really cool. That
Did you see that?
Found, but that's super cool. I got to look that up because that's really super clever. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I mean, in general, those three, Trump, W. Bush, and Clinton, they were all born around the same solar eclipse in Cancer. And it's really funny. I remember seeing some sciencey people on Twitter marveling over the fact that how unusual it is that three American presidents happen to be born within 2 months of each other in the same year. And I'm thinking to myself, desperately wanting to respond, yeah, because there was
Right.
that solar eclipse in Cancer on the US sun, and you had these like 3 presidents pop up, from that particular one, that particular eclipse. I no, I haven't looked at all of the groupings of the presidential births by eclipse. Obama obviously was born much later, but Obama was born like a couple of days or so before a solar eclipse. Or was it after? I think he might have been born a couple of days after a solar eclipse in Leo,
Because
conjunct Uranus.
he's got it would have to be, unless it's the prior to birth, because his moon is in Gemini and the sun is in Leo, so we'd
Oh,
have to
so
go
okay, so it
forward.
would have had to been after then. Yeah, so after he was born, like 2 days or so after he was born, or it might have been, well, less than a week, certainly less than a week. I'm sort of doing a rough calculation. Moon in Gemini, sun in early Leo. That's about maybe 3 days or so. Yeah, Obama was born about 3 days before a solar eclipse in Leo conjunct Uranus in Leo. And that's another major theme of the sun and Uranus that you see in American presidents. The obviously Trump's sun is conjunct the Uranus placement of W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's sun is conjunct Obama's, I believe, is Uranus. There's a bunch of like Sun Uranus synastry between the presidents that is really really weird. And again, kind of going back to what I was talking about with these figures in American history that have kind of risen to the top, who were either experienced a Uranus transit to their sun in Gemini when they kind of became a big deal, or they were born with the sun conjunct Uranus. The sun Uranus combination seems to spell out this idea of seems to symbolize the idea of the empowered person, the radical individual, the Superman, or the U.S. president, the leader of the free world, right? It's those kind of honorific and distinctly Uranian sorts of titles. People who can who have access to the button.
Access to the button. Yeah. Now, how do you explain? Here's another one for you.
Sure.
Around lunations, which I've noticed are again these turns when you get a lunation, a new moon, and whatever's happening there, it's a change in direction, and it's kind of like Saturn starts somewhere. I've seen those patterns in my life where Saturn return aside, even Saturn being somewhere and then returning to that place. It tells you a lot about what happened in the original point and so forth. So Trump's lunation was almost exactly concurrent with he was trying to extort Ukraine, which did not go well. And in fact, you could argue that that's when things really started to decline for him, because nothing worked after that, and really hasn't since, in the sense of he was impeached, and then we went into the election season, but he was bumbling and stumbling and leaving clues, that to be charged later.
I'm sorry, which lunation are you
His
referring to?
So he had in his progression,
by progression.
The sun moon lunation happened in
Mm-hmm.
the fall of 2019, concurrent with when he was trying to extort Ukraine.
And getting impeached.
No, but then the flow since then has been, it's almost like he's a little bit like a stock that drops and then goes up a little bit and drops some more, and then goes up a little bit, and people will say, oh, buy it because it's been dropping. No, don't, because it's going to drop some more. It'll just keep doing that. A little bit up, more down, a little bit up, more down. That has been the pattern for quite some time. You can argue that this thing that we just heard, that the FBI was reluctant to charge him and so forth. I understand all that, but I mean, right now he's really in the thick of it. I mean, this man he's got a serious problem in here.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's all self-inflicted. So much of this was completely avoidable. But yeah, I mean, obviously I hope that this, does end up going somewhere. I mean, in general, I'm surprised that this hasn't sort of hurt him as much before. when you look at his natal chart, for example, if you want to bring it up so we can take a look at it, you can see that he has the planet Mercury in his 12th whole sign house.
Yes.
And the 12th shows the things that can work against you, the things and like areas of vulnerability or weakness. And so when someone has Mercury in the 12th house, it can sometimes suggest that speech or documents, things that are written down, like information, ends up being the thing which works against you.
Yeah.
So, in this case, it's literally, classified documents that no one was supposed to see, that has been, key to his, the greatest accusations, made against him. I mean, even the, even the impeachment, the first one,
it was
stems from, illicit or leaked communications.
Exactly.
So he has a real Mercury problem there in the 12th. Interestingly, he also has Venus conjunct Saturn in the 12th house. So what's the other major area that he's gotten nailed on is his, disgusting treatment of women.
Yes.
He finally was convicted of the rape of Jean Carroll. And she's only, one of many people who've been able to make credible accusations of sexual assault against Trump, and so naturally, Venus is the principle of desire, and that can be kind of distorted or challenged when it's in the 12th house. It takes on an unsavory form potentially, or a happening in a bad context. And so it's also interesting to note that it's one of the reasons he's been taken down is by Stormy Daniels and his his dalliance there. That was meanwhile his wife was pregnant, I believe. So he was a married man at that time. I mean, it's just these are the other things that kind of really work against him in his life. And
the thing is, the Venus rules the 10th, rules the 3rd. The 3rd is also where you find records, being the natural place of Gemini. So that's another complication. The Venus being in the 12th becomes a really problematic planet. It's also, this I remember learning in Vedic, where they say the 12th is hidden love affairs because it's the 8th from the 5th. And that's exactly what he sort of was up to. But separately, what has this guy built his entire game is names and naming. He always profited from licensing his name. That's essentially Trump's whole thing, is you put my name on things, which now is really badly damaged. That also I see going to the 3rd. The 3rd sign is the idea of Mercury. I associate that with a name and naming.
Well, yeah, Jupiter and Neptune in the 3rd house. This is someone who, even if you really hate Trump, you can still acknowledge that he, in his own very dumb way, a very good communicator, because
for sure. Yes.
He speaks to people on a level they can understand. He always finds these very pithy ways to sum someone up. Remember it was Little Marco, and it was low energy Jeb, or was that low energy Joe? I forget which one was low energy.
Low energy Jeb, Bush.
Jeb. What was there were like some of the other ones. Have you heard his one for Ron DeSantis?
Ron DeSantis or
Meatball Run. Have you heard this? Meatball Run.
Well, he's definitely good at that.
Look at him, he's a meatball.
I mean, the thing is that in the end, though, this guy, he's like the leader of the vulgar, the leader of the deplorables. I mean, I think Hillary was entirely correct. He could never do well. It's been probably his lifelong injury or his lifelong wound that he can't actually impress people with a brain, because he himself, in the end, really isn't very smart. If you were smart, would a person do what he's doing now? I mean, the man is completely reckless. He's
a total fool. I mean, this is the village idiot, became president. Have you seen that Black Mirror show?
Yes, yes,
Have you
I've
seen
seen
did you have you
some.
seen that episode in the first season where there's that little comedic CGI character who says vulgar things,
I think
and he
not
kind
that
of
one.
insults politicians and stuff, and eventually the cartoon character like kind of runs for political office as a joke, but people just thinking to be funny, like, let's actually elect him. And so then they elect this cartoon character as president, and eventually the world turns into this like dark, like fascist dictatorship with this puppet as the head of it. And it's just it was too on the nose in terms of showing a story where people had elected the kind of class clown, or elected the village idiot to run them. But one thing I wanted to point about Hillary versus Trump, I think that's a perfect example of a situation where you have one person who's playing by the rules of the game and going up against an opponent who is playing in a completely different game.
Mm-hmm.
Hillary assumed, and not unfairly, she assumed that the game was chess. You make the better point, you use facts and reason and evidence for your arguments, and that's how you win.
Right.
And Trump was playing this completely different game. He was just like a monkey throwing feces at a, he wasn't there to play chess. He was just there to just make fun of the whole process or something. And so again, you can really see how this sort of the unbounded Uranian character, it's funny because I think in astrology we have a slight positive bias towards Uranus. I think we tend to look more favorably upon Uranus as the planet of revolution in favor of like human rights and progressive causes, and to be liberated from tradition. But the dark side of Uranus, I think, is really captured very well by someone like Trump, who disrupts the things that we actually like hold dear or that are actually important. Uranus can also act like a big middle finger, and sometimes it's flipping you the bird, right? Sometimes it's the revolution against you that Uranus is showing. So anyway, yeah, those are just some thoughts, I guess, on
You see, it
his
depends.
Uranus character.
The thing with astrology is that there are so many ways to build a story on the up or down side of something. So Uranus, you're right. You can assume too much of the positive side of it, and you're right. It's definitely, in fact, it has that sometimes is drawn as a Mars. There's a very edgy energy sometimes to Uranus, dismissive and so forth, including that the way this guy behaves, no question, although it tilts to the teenage Uranus, rebellion for its own sake and so forth, nor has it been particularly helpful for him.
Right.
There was a solar arc right on his ascendant when he ordered the coup, which I don't think was a very good idea for his future. Let's just put it that way. It's not, didn't turn out too well. But if you look at Uranus as, when you said earlier, it was discovered after the US was formed, actually. It was discovered a bit later, wasn't it? 1790 or something like that?
I think it was discovered in, well, I guess we can check.
Or 1783,
Uranus.
maybe? 1783, in that range? That rings a bell.
Uranus discovered, I think it might have been 1781. Let's see. Uranus discovered 1781. So Uranus was discovered in 1781, and the US like government wasn't really established until like 1789. But we can still see that, in general, if we look at kind of the world picture at the time, in 1781, Uranus was discovered through the aid of a technology, the telescope.
Right.
It just ends up kind of becoming symbolic in
Right.
some ways of like that same kind of breakthrough of this radical expansion of the known universe. Exactly. At that time, that it goes beyond what was known to be possible, going beyond human limits of vision.
Saturn.
you
Right.
know, that's what was happening in the world. You know, we were going beyond our own limits as a people up to that point, through the use of technology, the Industrial Revolution, and to rebel against the, you know, the divine right of kings, and really reaching this kind of flowering moment for the Enlightenment. And really,
Right.
the Uranus is kind of, I think, the planet of Enlightenment ideals
Right.
in many
So
ways.
now, if you think about so far, so it starts there, and you look at the U.S. experiment comes under tremendous strain in the Civil War, but the country holds together. You know,
Hmm.
wasn't great. I mean, they could have done a better job, but it did. You know, it did progress. It took till the 1960s in some ways. There's been some
Hmm.
progress. Then you get the Second World War. There was this attempt by Hitler and Mussolini and to some extent Franco to, in a sense, enslave the world. That's not what happened. Essentially, once
Uranus
Uranus
fought
was
back.
discovered, and Uranus is discovered in the 1780s, that's the rise of democracy. Because if you think of Uranus as the co-ruler of Aquarius at minimum, then you get the individual within the system. In other words, you're giving every person more power, even though, you know, there's a sense that Uranus is very individualistic, but there's also the social element of Aquarius, right? So the logic is, to me, with Uranus on the pure side, is more power to the people by giving individuals more power. And so I see the period we're in now, the world is in another crisis. There's this Plutonian element, you know, floating around. I think it can be defeated and we can go into another period of some form of democracy. I don't see democracy falling apart all over the world during
No,
this.
I mean, I think, you know, I am hopeful for the way that the world could be after we get through this,
Hmm.
you know, but I still dread
You still
going
which?
through it. I still dread going
Oh
through
yeah,
it,
well of course, no kidding.
I do think, that there's a better world potentially on the other side of it. I mean, there's just some really basic ass things that like we got to figure out as a country, and like, you know, we cannot be falling apart over really basic issues like, you know, are trans people allowed to exist? Yes, they are. Like,
Yes, of
leave them
course.
alone. Does a woman have the right to an abortion? Yes, she does.
Yes, she
Leave her
does.
alone. Like,
Right.
you know, this is it. You know, should everyone have the right to have a firearm and, you know, shoot up a classroom? No,
No, they should
absolutely
not.
not. Like,
Yeah, of
you know,
course.
the you know, and these are things that even if you look at you know, surveys of the whole country, like vast majorities of Americans do feel this way, but we just have a system that is that no longer represents, you know, the will of the people, and it will take, you know, through the course of this Uranus return and the kind of ongoing Pluto return of the establishment of the US government, because that'll happen with Pluto and Aquarius.
Mhm.
Um, you know, that with Pluto continuing to go through Aquarius, that maybe we can kind of renew our social contract,
Right.
and you know, really come to an agreement about, you know, what kind of country we want to be. But I also don't want to dismiss the possibility, though, that that could result in kind of a balkanization of the United States. We may have, it's like, if you want to, you know, if you want to live in the future, like, go live in the, you know, the section of the country where, you know, we kind of get to be that. And if you want to live in, you know, um, red state 1950s nostalgic Trump land, you know, go to, you know, go over there.
I mean, there is
Go
a
down
problem
south.
though. I mean, I don't know if you saw that. There's a major problem with that paradigm in that Gavin Newsom's interview with Sean Hannity, during which he lost his cool, in my opinion. I think he shouldn't have said this, but he said something that is true that I've been hoping someone would say. You know, he told Sean Hannity, "Hey, 70+% of the GDP comes from the blue states, and we're subsidizing your states," which he shouldn't have said. But the point is, the red states are being subsidized by the blue states. So, you know, you want to secede, but where are you going to go? Like, how are you going to make things work
Right.
here?
Well,
All
and
the,
that's, yeah.
you know,
And that's why I don't really want that to happen, because there's plenty of people who are stuck in those states. There are people who are going to be who are not going to be able to get out. I mean, people are family who live in every other kind of. I mean, this is an unworkable solution. We can't really do that here, not without gross human rights abuses,
Right.
and gross intrusions on people's basic rights. So I think yeah, I think that it makes sense that a country supports itself. So I don't have a problem insofar as blue states supporting subsidizing red states. That's what a country should do. A country
Exactly. Yeah, of course.
should redistribute its wealth so that it can support the neediest among us, no matter where they live. But I think it's a fair point to bring up in the context of the discussion of a US divorce, because that doesn't really work. We can't really divide up our assets like that.
Yeah, that's the
how
thing.
Who's gonna take the kids? Like, no, we can't do this.
Right. Exactly. So it's I mean, I think the thing though is that unless I'm completely missing the sense of what's happening overall, there is no real way to get beyond this Trumpist, fascist, authoritarian, anti-democratic movement without defeating it at the polls, unless you plan to take up arms and start shooting, which doesn't seem like a very good solution or even a plausible solution. So, so far, they've been defeated, but it's been close, and they still believe that this can work. And this is why it's so important for people to vote. And they must lose another election or two in order for them to finally realize, in a way, what Chris Christie is saying. I mean, what is the point to this guy? He keeps losing. Everything since 2016 has been a loss, including, by the way, I don't know if you've noticed that when you start seeing Democratic mayors being elected in red cities and so forth, that's usually a really bad sign for the upcoming general election, because it's telling you that the public mood is pulling away from backing these people. And you were seeing this in the years when Trump was in office. There would be a governorship in Louisiana or something, and it would be the Democrat that would win against the odds, and you'd see more Republicans voting, but even more Democrats voting on top of that, right? And those are patterns that are very troubling if you're the Republican Party. And they're kind of stuck because this guy has created a cult, and so a big section of voters follows him, and they can't attack him, or they lose those voters, or they'll become disenchanted or whatever. But it's not a good way, it's not a good plan, in my opinion, to win elections with this kind of attitude, because they're always in the 40s. No matter what, their ceiling is 45, 47. You need over 50.
Well, in general, I think that, I mean, and I know I'm speaking pretty frankly here. I think the main point of the Republican Party at this point is to give a voice to, I guess, grievance, like especially white male grievance.
Yes.
To rage against the dying of the light of a world that they took for granted, of being in complete control over, and that this is, in the same way that a cornered animal lashes out and is at its most dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's this fear of these people on the right that feel that they are losing their sense of dominance over their surroundings, and they're interpreting broader gains for previously marginalized groups as a threat to their own survival, and they don't have a model for how to exist in a system. They don't know how to be a knight at the round table. They only know how to be the pharaoh at the top of a pyramid. They don't realize that we would actually be much stronger. Like, the Avengers aren't made up of all the same people, right? It takes different personalities to have a team.
Exactly.
And I think that in general, very privileged and very especially wealthy white men have had these set of advantages for so long that it feels like it is a affront, as if it's sort of being challenged. And for the long haul, they're going to need to find a way to healthily participate and contribute to society instead of just assuming that everything should be by and for them. And maybe that's maybe that's some kind of future that we can have, but for right now we're still dealing with people who can't yet entertain the value
Yes.
that other people have, regardless of what part of society they come from or what they look like. And so that's I kind of got a bit off topic there, but I was just going to say that the main point is I think that's largely what the GOP seems to stand for these days. And so that's part of the reason why they're having this issue with elections and why they're feeling the need they have to do gerrymandering and other kind of anti-democratic tactics, because it's a losing strategy to appeal to a narrower and narrower and narrower strip of the electorate.
Right.
It would make much more sense to, try to appeal to more people, but all they really have, pardon me, is Trump and white male grievance.
Yeah, it's true. True. Which is and also deeply insulting and irrational in that I thought the GOP motto, the GOP core belief was, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make it happen. I mean, I thought that was what it was. Now they're saying, well, no, we should be getting something. Why can't you compete with other people? That's the whole point. That's the American model. Compete and make your presence felt. Don't say, well, I used to have a job in some small town and now there's no industry anymore. Well, then go somewhere else. Move around. Do something. That's what the Republican spirit is supposed to be. But in some ways now that's flipped over, and it's almost like they're pretending to be the welfare class while they're complaining, that things have turned sour. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think a lot of it is lack of education, knucklehead behavior. You don't have the bright IQs in that crew. I mean, is it a surprise that you see Trump's demographics and people without a college degree, white males? That's the core group. Even if there are other people in there, that's what sustains him fundamentally.
Yeah, I wish I knew, what the answer was to I think education could certainly help. I think there's not just correct education, but I also think we need to reduce the misinformation in society, yes, especially from mainstream sources like Fox News. And I'm not saying that you should always believe what the media tells you. You should be critical regardless of where your news comes from. Mm-hmm. But Fox News is a completely different animal. Totally. And it's ilk, which is even more right wing, like Newsmax. They're even worse.
I'll tell you though about Fox News. What's interesting, but this to me, I interpret also as a fracture on the right, in that Fox has gotten in trouble for pushing it, and you're more likely to go on Fox than on MSNBC and find a very contrarian point of view. For example, Brett Byers' interview with Trump is a classic, I'm going to get in your face and really call you out, which is the last thing that a guy like Trump would want. And there have been other people on there, like Bill Barr. He was on Fox and he says, this guy's toast. I'm sorry, there's no way out. Very unlikely you'll see an MSNBC Republican, advocating their views. MSNBC is like everything is the same pretty much. So in that sense, what you get with Fox is inadvertently almost they're doing fair and balanced through the back door, in part because they've been sued and in part because someone gets in there and inevitably tells the truth. But I also interpret that as they're divided, right? That party is divided on all fronts because they know that it's a really bad idea to follow this guy, but they're captive of his audience, right?
And I guess you could say a similar sort of dynamic exists with other even more liberal networks. I think they also know that if we keep talking about Trump, that'll keep the ratings up.
Yeah, that's
just
true.
Because everything that, and so it's really annoying because Trump has created this situation where he can't be ignored, and that would really be the best way to deal with him is just to not even pay him any attention. But when he's doing things like inciting insurrections against the government, then you have to kind of pay attention and you have to listen to him. Two things I wanted to say is one of the other things I'm looking forward to with Saturn in Aries is the Saturn return of Fox News, which started during the
Yes,
previous
that's
Saturn
true.
Aries period.
By the way, they're
So
hurting right now. Based on their
right.
first programming, they're hurting badly.
So well, and I think we're getting almost a slight preview of this because the day that they had to give up the day that they decided to settle with the Dominion lawsuit, the Dominion voting machine lawsuit, was the day of the solar eclipse in Aries. And we often know that events that occur around the time of an eclipse, those are going to tend to continue on through those eclipses that happen across that sign. And so we have 2 more springs of solar eclipses in Aries. And so I think that these will be happening in the same sign as the Saturn placement of Fox News. And it'll be interesting to see how this story develops of hopefully their collapse. But it's a bit of schadenfreude there. So yeah, you can actually see Saturn is the very beginning of Aries. So we actually have quite a ways before the Saturn placement itself actually gets hit by a solar eclipse in Aries. I love that Moon Mars conjunction. It's just an IV drip of rage for especially for older folks who are watching cable. One of the other things I wanted to say about Trump's chart really quick is one of the reasons why I think it's been so difficult to get him, for the things that he's done, is when you look at the ruler of his 12th house, so the planet that represents his enemies, it's his moon.
Yes.
And his moon has one major problem. It's eclipsed.
Right.
The moon in his chart is eclipsed. His enemies are eclipsed. And this makes it very difficult, to actually gain traction or to rise up against him. The people who've risen up against him have typically failed. He's been very good at avoiding the clutches of his enemies, at least up until this point.
So you don't assign, because I assign the axis, like to me the 6th is also enemies, 6th and 12, and then you bring in Saturn, and that's not so good because now Saturn is in the 12th, and it looks like right now Saturn through Pisces, his enemies are gaining ground, his opponents.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I certainly think that the 6th house partakes in some qualities of the opposite house, the 12th. I think all opposite houses share some sort of qualities. I guess I haven't really thought of the 6th as enemies. I guess the 6th sometimes feels like an enemy because it's the stuff that you gotta do. It's the stuff you can't avoid. You have to sort of really work at it. I tend to think of the 12th house as one's fears, one's vulnerabilities, one's weaknesses, the things that work against you, and sometimes literally the people that work against you.
Right. But isn't his moon damaged by being the ruler of the 12th? Automatically that hurts the moon.
So that's why I'm saying it's not good for his enemies, because in general in his chart, because the ruler of the 12th house is eclipsed. Yeah.
Eclipsed.
So it's like normally his enemies would oppose his agenda, the ruler of the 1st, the sun. But it just so happens that the light of the moon was being extinguished.
Let me tell you though, I want to see this guy, like often with astrology, for me, as I'm watching to see, okay, what does this person do with this? I want to see him pull out of this when Saturn reaches the square to his sun and moon from the 8th sign. I want to see what he does with that. And moreover, I could see this guy paying the ultimate price post the election, because he definitely doesn't like the legal situation when planets are in early Aries, because it triggers that T-square of his. And then when it gets later in the sign, it squares the Saturn Venus. So my feeling is Trump is going to really pay his dues after the election, not prior to the election. based on where Saturn is going, if I had to guess, you know.
Yeah. Well, I haven't. Well, I'd need to look back at what was going on for him in the mid '90s when Saturn made that same pass.
It wasn't good.
Well, I believe he was still in the middle of like divorce issues.
Yeah,
In
there's
1995.
a kind of, if you look at his trajectory, the 90s were his lost decade, starting in
Yeah.
like pretty much the 90s mirror the Aquarius is when he loses the election, and then he doesn't really resurrect until the very late 90s. The middle was when he declared that major loss. He was kind of out of it at the time.
It was his real trash period. He was in the tabloids. He was
Right.
going through all these like divorces and all these sort of tawdry headlines. Yeah, the 90s were a bad time for Trump. The 80s were probably his best time. He was in step with the kind of culture of greed at that time, and
Yeah.
he was this like up and coming wunderkind of real estate in the 80s. Yeah, the 90s was his like trash tabloid Taj Mahal failure, divorce era. His the Trump pageants, that's when he met Melania, was at that in one of those pageants, I believe. And then of course the 2000s was his like celebrity in his Apprentice era, his reinvention as a reality TV star. I mean, really all of these different roles that he's had, they really do seem to track with Uranus's transits through the signs. He came out as a birther right as Uranus ingressed into Aries in 2011. That was when he really began
Right.
coming out with this kind of crazy stuff. And then I was also knowing that he's kind of had this relationship with Uranus's transits through the signs, I was really curious about what Uranus would mean when it went into Taurus in 2018, because I'm like, well, now he's president. And Uranus, that would seem to suggest Uranus in the 10th house while he's president, that would seem to suggest his leadership ambitions are kind of disrupted, and they were, because he lost the 2020 election.
Well, right, but then why? Okay, so why then, if you see Uranus in here, why do you think that if it's disrupted here, why is it suddenly going to help him there on the MC?
Because look what's conjuncted is Jupiter. Uranus, when he was president and Uranus ingressed into his 10th house in 2018, in that context, it seemed to signal the disruption of his career at that point as president. Now that it's making its way to his midheaven, if Jupiter was not there and Uranus is making its way to his midheaven, then I would still assume that it would be another time of reinvention. It would be like it would be like if he decided at that point to change his career from being like a post-presidential statesman to being like a I don't know, an artist or something. Just something completely different. But the fact that it's with Jupiter is what tells us that this wouldn't just be an ordinary expansion of one's sort of public or professional role, but like a radically expansive one, or that there would be this more unbounded notion of Jupiter going through the 10th. And in this particular context where someone is facing constraints, Jupiter's the planet of freedom. Jupiter's the planet of mercy. Jupiter's the planet of forgiveness. And on an extreme scale, well, what would be pretty extreme? What would be a really extreme Jupiter type of thing to happen? Well, this, I was facing 400 years, and then my judge got me off. It would be something like that. Yeah.
Well, I hope you're wrong. I hope you're
Yeah,
wrong.
me too. Me too.
No,
I'm not.
I mean, I personally think that the Jupiter, this chart is damaged. This guy is trending downward. I think it's Jupiter. Jupiter is not always like I was mentioning about Bernie Madoff. There are cases where Jupiter can totally sink you. You have to be very careful with the planet. It's not always, in other words, fame and infamy are two sides of a coin.
That's true.
I actually see this as, in a way, like the final humiliation, but we'll see. Time will tell. Because to me, there's something here with his ascendant switching to Scorpio. It has a quality of the end, the finish of his prospects.
Yeah,
But we'll see.
I still think he'll end up being like a. I mean, he already is kind of this, but I think he'll end, especially when Uranus enters Gemini. That's when I really suspect that he will become kind of the face of a new. He'll become the president of a new country,
The president
like
of the Confederacy.
yes, he'll be the new Confederate president. Yeah, he'll be
that's possible.
the new Jefferson Davis, and even if he does that from behind bars, you know, I mean, Uranus is about like freedom, right? Busting out of bars, like it's busting out of convention or out of the status quo. And so I just, again, I'm not saying this with any joy, you know, but I think that you know, Trumpism is not something that's going to be defeated through, I think, the conventional methods. I think, you know, it'll require a full scale, a full deconstruction of ourselves as a country, and to renegotiate the social contract and to reach a new consensus about what it is we believe and what the rules are of being in this society, and for everyone to know how they can be a part of it, and what things are off limits and what things are still up for discussion, you know. And you know, we are so divided on some of those basics that we really can't, like, a functioning society cannot be like, well, just like Abraham Lincoln said, right? A house divided cannot stand. We cannot continue while every day we are hearing about schools being massacred. We cannot have this is not what happens in a normal country or a normal time. This is not I mean, it just makes me wonder, what is it going to take? Like, what is it going to take for the Americans to?
To me, it's what it's going to take is we have to defeat these people every election possible. We have to defeat them.
Yeah.
And there's really no other way for them to finally realize, well, we're not winning, so we need to switch gears. That's my best guess at the moment.
Right.
Because any other guess is really scary. You know?
Any other guess is really, really scary, and I really hope it doesn't come to that. I also think it might come to that, but if it comes to that, it's going to be really scary because, you know, they're armed. They love guns, you know, and I wouldn't want to touch a gun. Like,
but then it'll depend on which way the law enforcement in the American army behaves, right? Which way?
Well, and that's a problem too, because our military is kind of divided.
Yeah, that's true.
From what I'm hearing, you know, there's unfortunately a scarily large Trump contingent within the American military. This is as serious as it gets. I mean, this is literally the guy that orchestrated an attempted coup on the United States government, and he has supporters in the U.S. military.
I know, it's crazy.
I mean, this is a national security risk, right? That this is going on, and so I just have no idea exactly how this, you know, will be resolved. I think the most peaceful way, that's why I think in some ways the more peaceful way would be to just to have a divorce, a national divorce, and to just say, okay, we're seceding from each other, you know. But what happens though? Who has control over the nukes? Do we really want Trumpistan to have all the nukes? What happens if they have like the military bases that are still in like the Trump states? Like, I mean,
it's complicated.
It's complicated. I mean, otherwise, yeah, what we're talking about. Otherwise, if you know, there can't be some sort of peaceful solution figured out, or we can't just get them to somehow back down. It will take a war, and that's what it's taken for each pass of Uranus through Gemini. It's taken that sacrifice, and I don't say that like I'm ready to do that or something. Like, I'm not.
Yeah, of course.
And you know, I wish to God that, you know, this wasn't you know, happening.
All right, on that happy note, we'll end it for this time. That was fascinating. I look forward to another discussion with you soon.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, it was nice talking with you. I hope everyone who's watching this has enjoyed this. And I also have a YouTube, but I haven't cleared it up. in quite a while. There's a lot of my old content still on there. But in any case, you can visit me and my work at my website, patrickwatsоnastrology.com. And you can
Yes, and
also follow me on Twitter at pwatsonastro.
I'll make sure that I put all the references in the video description so they can
Thank
find
you.
you as well.
Awesome.
All right,
Thank
till
you.
next time. That was great.